So on Saturday afternoon, when I was in the Lord's presence, He put this phrase in my heart. I heard the Lord say, giant slayers. A giant slayer is someone who kills or defeats a giant, often in a heroic or courageous manner. In a figurative sense, a giant slayer is anyone who overcomes insurmountable challenges or obstacles. A person who defeats formidable opponents or enemies and achieves a remarkable victory against overwhelming odds. In modern usage, the term giant slayer, I'm sure you've come across it a lot, is often metaphorically used to describe underdogs who achieve unexpected victories, or innovators who disrupt industries or challenge established norms, or even individuals who overcome personal struggles or adversity. Did you know that this term, even when used by people of the world, is actually inspired by the biblical accounts of giant slayers such as David, who defeated Goliath, and has since become a powerful symbol of faith, courage, resilience, and determination? This morning, I am certain that God is calling every one of you to rise up and be a giant slayer in the kingdom. However, I wonder if God is calling you to conquer the personal giants that have been holding you back. How many of you have been struggling with internal giants like depression, guilt, condemnation, insecurity, negativity, lack, debt, poverty, or addiction to lust, pornography, alcohol, cigarettes, or drugs? Or might God be calling you this morning to challenge the giants that defy His kingdom? Think about the giants of social media that distract God's people away from their faith, luring them into vain pleasures and away from godly pursuits. Or might God be calling you to defeat the giants of false doctrine that have crept into our churches and led believers away from the truth? What about the giants of sickness, such as cancer and other life-threatening illnesses, that rob people of the abundant life that Jesus came to give? Finally, have you considered the giants of fame, popularity, and wealth that tempt God's people to prioritize worldly pursuits over His heart? Whether God is calling you this morning to slay personal giants that you have been encountering in your life, personal giants that have been holding you back from your destiny, or whether God is calling you to defeat the giants that seem to be standing defiant against His kingdom, is something that only God can reveal to you. But this morning, I want to talk to you about a few giant slayers from the Bible and how God used them in their generation. What a powerful impact they had on His kingdom. The average Christian would probably know only about the story of how little David, full of faith, conquered the giant Goliath. If that includes you, and you thought that David was the only giant slayer in the Bible, you couldn't be more wrong. The Bible is actually filled with accounts of God's people who defeated the giants in their generation. Let me run you through a few examples. Deuteronomy 3 talks about how Moses and the Israelites defeated Og, a giant king of Bashan, in battle. Joshua 11 talks about how the Israelites, led by Joshua, defeated the giants of Canaan, including the Anakim, in battle. Joshua 15 and Judges chapter 1 will tell you how Caleb, one of the Israelite spies, drove out the giants of Hebron, including the descendants of Anak. Or have you read the account of Samson, who killed many Philistines, including a giant who was named Goliath's brother? 1 Samuel 14 talks about how Jonathan, King Saul's son, and his armor bearer defeated a group of Philistine soldiers, which included some giants. And lastly, 2 Samuel 2 and 1 Chronicles 20 include the accounts of how David's warriors, Abishai, Sibbecai, and others, killed Goliath's brothers, who were also giants. These instances demonstrate God's power and provision for His people as they face the giants of their time, or in other words, the seemingly insurmountable challenges that surrounded them. If you think about it, giant slayers typically don't have the finest artillery, or in most cases, they don't even hold the highest positions in military ranks. In fact, many of them don't even have a place in the military. A clear depiction of this truth is found in the exchange between King Saul and David, as recorded in 1 Samuel 17, just before David's iconic battle with Goliath. Let me read that to you. "Don't be ridiculous," Saul replied. There's no way you can fight this Philistine and possibly win. You're only a boy, and he's been a man of war since his youth. How many of you have heard these very words spoken to you? These words that have held you back all these years from being the giant slayer that God has always called you to be. Let me remind you of this truth one more time. Giant slayers typically don't have the finest artillery, or in most cases, they don't even hold the highest position in military ranks. In fact, many of them don't even have a place in the military. Here's all you need to become a giant slayer in God's kingdom in your generation. Let me quickly run you through 3 important keys this morning. In order to be a giant slayer, the first key is that you need to identify the real giant. Often hiding behind the most difficult people and the most difficult circumstances that we face in life is a spiritual giant. The Bible makes this clear in the passage we just read in Ephesians 6:12. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. Like I said earlier, often hiding behind the most difficult people or circumstances that we face in life is a spiritual giant. Hiding behind that difficult boss who makes your life at work miserable every day could be a giant of insecurity. Or consider that difficult relative who's always giving you a hard time and goes around bad-mouthing you and your family members. God can help you identify that your relative is not the real giant, but hiding behind that difficult person could be a giant of jealousy that causes him or her to behave in that manner. Let me narrate to you a real-life incident that happened a few years ago to help you understand this better. I was counseling a girl who had chosen a homosexual lifestyle in college. She was from a Christian family, and her mom was beyond shocked when she began to notice her homosexual behavior patterns, and at this time they reached out to me to counsel her. A few minutes before the mom and daughter arrived at my office, I remember being in my house getting ready to go meet them, and as I was praying, the Lord revealed something to me. He showed me in the spirit that this girl had been sexually abused as a child. Behind that apparent exterior of stubbornly choosing a homosexual lifestyle was the giant of child sexual abuse that had driven her to choose a path of homosexuality. While I was getting all geared up and prayed up to go and defeat this giant of homosexuality, God gently revealed to me that the real giant that we were dealing with here was not the giant of homosexuality, but a giant of child sexual abuse. So I remember going down to my office, and I asked the girl gently, "Have you ever been abused as a child?" And then she broke into tears and began to narrate this incident to her mother and me. Her mother, of course, who was in absolute shock and disbelief about this uncle, a close and trusted family friend who would often visit their house, and how he had molested her several times in her own house when she was a little girl. And the mother said to her, "Why did you never tell us about this?" To which the girl replied, and for those of you who know, most adults also who have been abused as little children will reply, "I didn't know how to. I never thought you would believe me." I took it from here, and I helped both of them understand that these abusive encounters that she had experienced as a child had traumatized her to such an extent that she felt repulsive towards men, and long story short, led her to choose a homosexual lifestyle. I also helped them understand that the real giant that needed to be defeated here was not homosexuality, but child sexual abuse and the trauma that came with it. They received this revelation from the Lord, and following that, God beautifully led her into a season of inner healing from all the trauma of child sexual abuse. And glory be to God, a year and a half later, she was completely free from homosexuality. And it's been about 7 years now that she's been walking in complete freedom. I narrated this incident to you to help you understand that not every giant that you are confronted with is going to be apparent and staring you in the face like Goliath, especially in a dispensation like ours, where we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, powers, rulers, authorities, and spiritual wickedness in high places. In every case, it is important for you to identify the real giant before you can defeat him. Take William Wilberforce, for instance. He was a British abolitionist and a member of parliament. We all know that William Wilberforce was instrumental in abolishing black slavery in the United Kingdom. He played a crucial role in the Black Slavery Act, Trade Act of 1807, which ended the British international slave trade. However, Wilberforce continued to fight for the complete abolition of slavery, and his efforts ultimately led to the passage of the Slavery Abolition Act in 1833, which formally freed all the slaves in the British Empire. However, that's the part you know from history. This is the part I want you to pay attention to. Before William Wilberforce abolished slavery and freed all the slaves, he had to identify the real giant behind the transatlantic slave trade. When you and I look at the problem, it looks like slavery is the giant. But what William Wilberforce identified was that the real giant behind this transatlantic slave trade was racism. He recognized that the enslavement of Africans was actually rooted in a deep-seated belief of white superiority. Wilberforce understood that this was the real giant that he was up against. Long story short, through his tireless efforts, Wilberforce helped shift this moral narrative, exposing the inherent cruelty and injustice of racism. Ultimately, with the Slave Abolition Act of 1833, he ensured that slavery ended in the British Empire. The same giant that Wilberforce defeated in UK in the 19th century was the same giant that Martin Luther King defeated in the United States of America in the 20th century. Through his nonviolent resistance, his powerful oratory and strategic leadership, Martin Luther King, as most of you know, defeated the giant of racism that was behind the lingering legacy of slavery in the US. He exposed the hypocrisy of a country that proclaimed freedom and equality but denied them to African Americans. How many of you know Charles Finney? He was one of the greatest American evangelists and revivalists of the 19th century. According to historical accounts, Charles Finney was able to identify 4 real giants that were stopping revival in the church. In many of his talks, he would talk about how it was important for the church of that time to defeat these 4 giants before revival could come. And he named these giants as apathy, lukewarm Christianity, formalism, which was an overemphasis on ritualistic tradition and outward forms of religiosity, and materialism, which was taking their heart away from eternal values and spiritual priorities. Now I want to talk closer to home, the things that you struggle with. I don't know how many of you are setting out to abolish slavery or even bring about revival in the church, but I'm sure you struggle with things like your career, your purpose. And have you ever read the story of Stephen King? Often in his talks, he would talk about 2 of the biggest giants that he faced in his career as an author. He called them rejection and criticism. In fact, Stephen King's first novel, Carrie, was rejected 30 times. He was told that his writing was not good enough and that he should quit. And he also talks about how in the earlier days of his career, his own wife, Tabitha, doubted his ability to make a living as a writer. Stephen King had to identify these giants of rejection and criticism and keep doing what he felt called to do. And before he went on to become a world-renowned author that he is today, who's written over 60 novels that have sold over 350 million copies worldwide, and he has a net worth of $500 million, making him one of the most famous and richest authors in the world today. What giant is God calling you to defeat in your life, in your generation? You need to identify the giant before you can defeat it. Is it a giant of indifference that is stopping the intimacy in your marriage? Is it a giant of rebellion that is causing your children to behave the way they do? Is it a giant of pornography that hinders intimacy in your marriage? Is it a giant of depression that keeps you from your destiny? Is it a giant of addiction that keeps you bound? Is it a giant of condemnation that taunts you every day, making you feel less than who you really are, a child of God? Is it a giant of debt or a giant of poverty that is stopping you from experiencing the abundance that God wants you to enjoy? Could it be a giant of unbelief that holds you back from walking in faith? Is it a giant of worry and anxiety that keeps you up all night worrying about the future? Or is it a giant of sickness that is stopping you from receiving the healing that Jesus purchased for you more than 2,000 years ago by his finished work on the cross. We just spoke about the first key, how you need to identify the giant before you can defeat it. The second key that I want to leave with you this morning is a key that can help you to rise up and be a giant slayer in your generation. And the second key is to receive divine strategy. Paul says we do not wage war as the world does. In order to receive divine strategy to defeat giants, you need to begin to look at your battle from a divine perspective. The more you look at your battle from a worldly perspective, you're only going to identify the challenges that stare you in the face. But in order to identify the giant that's behind that battle and to receive the divine strategy to defeat that giant, you need to begin to look at that battle from God's perspective. The same strategy will not work for every giant. Every giant you face is unique, and so is every battle. And therefore, you need to receive a divine strategy from God that is uniquely crafted to defeat that specific giant that you are facing in that particular season of your life. Coming back to giant slayer David, let's look at the list of battles and giants that God gave David victory over, including the specific and different battle strategies that he used each time. I'll quickly run you through about 6 or 7. David used, as you all know, a single precise stone shot from his sling to defeat Goliath. In order to defeat the Philistine army after defeating Goliath, David and the Israelites launched what they call, or what is called today, a pursuit and rout strategy by chasing the Philistine army and defeating them. In order to defeat the Amalekites, David used what people now call a surprise attack strategy, leading his men in a bold and swift assault against the Amalekites to recover his family and defeat the enemy. In order to defeat the Philistines at Keilah, David and his men used what you call a defensive strategy, defending the city of Keilah against the Philistine attack, with God giving them the victory. Fifth one, in order to combat Saul's repeated attempts to kill him, David used what now soldiers call an evasion and escape tactic, which included hiding in caves, fleeing to different cities, and disguising himself to avoid Saul's attempts on his life. In order to defeat the giant Ishbi-Benob, Abishai, one of David's warriors, used a rescue and counter-attack strategy, saving David from Ishbi-Benob's attack and then killing the giant. And lastly, in order to defeat the Philistine giants, Saph and Goliath's brothers, David's warriors used individual combat strategies, engaging and defeating the giant warriors one by one. It's clear from all of these 7 examples that even though David had a roaring victory against the giant Goliath, he didn't use the same strategy for all of the giants or the battles that he faced in his life. David and his warriors had to repeatedly trust in God's power, promise, and guidance to receive a different divine strategy each time to achieve victory over the giants that were facing them. I'd like to share with you the testimony of renowned Australian Christian worship leader Darlene Zschech. Most of you know her as songwriter and worship pastor at Hillsong. When talking about her victorious battle over breast cancer, she shares a few insights. She says that more than the physical cancer, she was able to identify that the real giants that were staring her in the face were fear and self-pity. Darlene Zschech has openly spoken about the fear that gripped her when she first received the cancer diagnosis and how she overcame that fear with faith. She also talked about the self-pity and how she had to resist that temptation to feel sorry for herself and instead choose to focus on God's goodness and love. Talking about the divine strategy that she received to combat the physical giant of breast cancer and the spiritual giants of fear and self-pity, we learned that Darlene Zschech employed a divine strategy which was focusing on God's goodness and love. If you watch her testimonies that are repeatedly broadcasted on YouTube channels and other online media, you would hear her talk about how she had to look away from fear and self-pity and turn her attention towards God's goodness and love. And if you think about it, cancer was not the only battle that she had faced in her life. In her earlier days as a worship leader, where she battled the giants of false worship and spiritual complacency, I'm sure her divine strategy was different. They were strategies such as bold declarations of faith and passionate evangelisms. But in her battle against cancer, the divine strategy was to focus on God's goodness and love, and the divine weapons she chose were praise and worship, which helped her defeat the giants of fear and self-pity, and allowed her to lift her eyes above the giants to unlock her healing, hope, and a deeper intimacy with God. I recently saw her post that it's been 11 years and she's free of cancer, and she celebrated the fact that her oncologist said, I'm officially going to remove your name from my list and you will require no follow-ups. And this shows us that in different seasons of your life, there will be different battles and there will be different giants that will confront you. And you ought to receive a specific divine strategy to defeat that giant. And that brings me to my third key, which is to choose the right weapons. I just recounted to you the testimony of Darlene Check, that in her battle against cancer, the divine strategy was to focus on God's goodness and love, while the divine weapons were praise and worship, which helped her defeat the giants of fear and self-pity. The Bible tells us in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 4 and 5, "For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God, to the pulling down of strongholds, casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ." Before we talk about this verse in a spiritual sense, I want to quickly bring you back to David, the greatest giant slayer of all times. You know, when David put on Saul's armor, this is what he said. Then Saul gave David his own armor, a bronze helmet and a coat. David put it on, strapped the sword over it, and took a step or two to see what it was like, for he had never worn such things before. "I can't go in like this," he protested to Saul. "I'm not used to them." So David took them off again. And then he picked up 5 smooth stones from a stream and put them into his shepherd's bag. Then, armed only with his shepherd's staff and sling, he started across the valley to fight the Philistine. David replied to the Philistine, "You come to me with sword, spear, and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the God of heaven's armies, the God of the armies of Israel. And everyone assembled here will know that the Lord rescues his people, but not with sword and spear. This is the Lord's battle, and he will give you to us." A lot of times in our battle against people, or so we imagine, and in our battle against circumstances, we use worldly weapons. And that's why Paul says, the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God. Imagine if David had chosen the traditional weapons of war. If, the king of Israel was offering him his entire armor and his weapons, he couldn't even walk with it, forget defeating the giant, right? So David had to receive wisdom from God and choose the right weapons. In this case, it was 5 smooth stones. And if you thought about it and ever wondered that David using a stone and a sling to defeat Goliath was a one-off incident, let me draw your attention to more unusual weapons that giant slayers in the Bible, as led by God, used to bring down their enemies. For those of you who haven't read your Bibles, you probably, will be thinking that the slingshot is probably the only unusual weapon that David used. But if you are a giant slayer in God's kingdom, God will always lead you to use unusual weapons. Have you considered how Samson used a donkey's jawbone to defeat 1,000 Philistine warriors? Or how the Israelites and Joshua used trumpets and ram's horn to bring down the walls of Jericho? Have you read the book of Judges, where is recorded a story of a woman who used a millstone to defeat Abimelech, a Canaanite king, and how she dropped a millstone on his head, crushing his skull? Or how Gideon and his men used pitchers and torches to confuse and defeat the Midianite army? Or how the Israelite army used the prophet Elisha's bones to defeat the Moabite army? Or how David's men used stones from a river to defeat Absalom's army? Coming back to this verse, the Bible says that the weapons of our warfare are not of this world, but they are mighty through God, for the pulling down of strongholds, casting down of imagination, and every lofty thing that lifts itself up against the knowledge of God. And that's why the third key that I want to bring to you this morning is that we choose the right spiritual weapons to defeat the giants that stand in the way of our destiny. We've read the story about how King Jehoshaphat used praise and worship to defeat 3 enemy nations that came against him. We've read about Daniel, who used prayer and fasting as his weapon to bring about angelic intervention, and how Elijah used prayer, the building of an altar and an offering of sacrifice, to summon fire from heaven in order to defeat 450 prophets of Baal in one day. We also read in the New Testament about how Jesus used the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God, to defeat Satan's temptation in the wilderness. In the same way, you and I need to choose the right weapons of warfare that are not of this world, that are more than arguments, that are more than reasoning, that are more than verbal attacks or even physical attacks. The kind of weapons that are not of this world, weapons that can bring down strongholds, that can cast down imaginations and every lofty thing that lifts itself against the knowledge of God. I'd like to end with this story of two very powerful Christian couples. And this story might, in particular, minister to those of you who are married. Have you ever heard the inspiring testimony of renowned preacher and pastor T.D. Jakes and his wife Sarita? Somewhere in the course of their ministry, they talk about how they were heading towards a very bad marital breakdown. And they were able to identify that the real giants were not each other. A lot of times we think the real giant is our spouse. But through prayer, they were able to identify that the real giant in their marital struggles was pride, communication breakdown, and external pressures. They talk about how they employed divine strategies of prayer, mutual submission, and intentional communication, and how, armed with divine weapons of love, forgiveness, and humility, they conquered the giants that were attacking their marriage. And even today, their testimony and their marriage remains a source of inspiration to so many young Christian couples around the world. Rick Warren and Kay Warren have a similar story. They talk about how there was a season when their marriage really took a beating. Instead of blaming people or blaming each other, they sought the Lord in prayer, and the Lord showed them that the real giant in their marriage was burnout. A lot of times, burnout in ministry can take a toll on your marriage. And they talk about how they entered a season of, receiving divine strategy. And, today they're together going strong, more than 40 years. There are giants facing us in every facet of our life. It's something for you to find out if in this season of your life, is God calling you to defeat a personal giant, an internal giant that's daunting you, that's stopping you from your destiny, that's attacking your marriage, that's attacking your children, or the peace in your family. Or in this season of your life, is God calling you to be that giant slayer for your generation?